Last week we already talked about the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age and the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. What we're going to go on to in this chapter is what happens after the agricultural revolution, when people start to build villages, towns, and eventually walled cities, and they start what we generally call civilization. We know this mainly through archaeological evidence, and now we're getting into written evidence, where people are talking about their cities, or what they did in their cities, or how they traded with other people. Trade is very important. Once you get a civilization that domesticates animals, then they can start trading. They can use camels, they can use donkeys, and carry more than what they can physically carry. And this is very, very important for trading. Eventually, the trading is going to go into new forms of technology, but we'll talk about that in a minute. This part of the chapter focuses on two separate civilization groups in different places. The first is the Mesopotamians. These are the people between the Tigris and Euphrates River, place that we now call Iraq, in the middle of the Iraqi desert. This is one place where civilization is going to grow up. Now, it's going to get confusing. The area is Mesopotamia, but the different civilizations that will grow up are going to be called different things. So don't get confused, just keep up with me. The other area we're going to talk about is Egypt. And because of geographical differences and cultural differences, Egypt is going to stay Egypt. It is going to stay a civilization, and a very self-contained and constant civilization until about 44 CE. So we're going to go back in the Egyptians and talk about them for their 3,000-year history. So the Mesopotamians is the area, and the people, however, the different dynasties are going to go by different names. Egypt will stay the same for this time. So the Mesopotamians, living between the Tigris and Euphrates River in a desert, developed agriculture and irrigation so that they could have consistent agriculture. Because the one factor in building a city between these two rivers is not that they had constant access to water, but that water was undependable. That water would flood without warning because they had no idea what was upstream, which were basically mountains that had snow on them. They did not know when it would flood, and so consequently, these rivers were not kind to the people. They had to learn how to tame them as much as they could. So the first culture that's going to grow up there, archaeologists are going to call it the Ubayyad culture. They had extremely sophisticated irrigation systems, and they had extremely sophisticated buildings, not just huts, but temples, the largest buildings of their culture. And these temples served both a religious and ceremonial function, but it was also the warehouse for the grain and the seeds. They developed a priestly caste or group, a social group. And what these priests had differently than the rest of the population was literacy. They figured out how to write, and because they could write, because they could keep records, they became the people who distributed the grain. That way they could keep records of who got it, and people couldn't choose. It was much more fair. So you had a civilization in the Ubayyads and later where it was the priests that controlled the economy. And these temples like this white temple at Uruk, were very large temples built out of mud bricks. You can see there's not a lot left to it because, well, it's 5,000 years old. It's ancient. And so even though desert area is dry, these temples, these 5,000-year-old buildings, would eventually start to decay. In Mesopotamia is where we see the development of basically a city culture. The different cities throughout this area, they are states unto themselves, meaning that each city had a king and a group of priests. Each city had walls and a civilization. And so everyone in the city identified with their king, with their god, with their region. This did not mean it was necessarily peaceful. There was trade and there was war back and forth. And the early culture to take control of a lot of this area were from the city of Sumer. They were the Sumerians. And these are the people that developed the style of writing known as cuneiform or wedge-shaped writing. And all it was something like the mud pies that you made as a kid after a rainstorm, and they had a wedged shape writing instrument, and they created this particular style of writing. These are the tablets, some of the tablets that we found. We found many of them, especially those that were important enough for the civilization to bake. Once they're baked, they become permanent records. Now, we have found thousands of these clay tablets, and I'll tell you a story in chapter 2 that explains why we have so many of these. But for now, you will see it's not an alphabet. They are pictographic writings. They form pictures. If you see the one on the right, you can see it actually has some pictures in it. I mean, it looks like there's a picture at the top, looks like a nice steaming hot bowl of soup. I have no idea what that means. But because pictures are difficult to make, they can be misinterpreted, and they take too long, they came up with shorthands. So this cuneiform writing is not an alphabet. It is a representation of pictures and numbers. The vast majority of these tablets that we have found are not stories, are not histories. The vast majority are, in fact, accounting records. Who got what grain and when. So the Sumerians were, in essence, a writing civilization and a civilization that kept records of itself. Now, early writing is going to be cumbersome. It's only going to be read by a handful of people. But if you've got royal families, it's important to be able to trace those families down. These first and earliest historical writings often take the shape of genealogies of royal families as well. Now, they will record some of their mythology. A handful of the tablets that we have found are stories, and I'll talk about them in a couple of minutes. But the main Sumerian cities that the Sumerians took over, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, and Kish, were all important cities at this time. They all had their own priests, and they all had their own temples and their own city gods. Now, these areas that we're talking about in between the Tigris and Euphrates River, you can see from this map, are part of the Fertile Crescent, that green area. And you can see by how the Fertile Crescent moves over the top of the area marked Syria, that you can understand how this became a trade route. So you have a trade route that goes from the Mediterranean Sea up and over the desert and down into Mesopotamia. Obviously, that desert was too difficult to cross, or they would have cut a lot of time off of it. But of course, they're dealing with area that doesn't have a lot of water, so it's very hard to transverse. So that Fertile Crescent plays an important role, not just in agriculture, but also in the trade routes that are going to develop. The Sumerians were polytheists, meaning that they had many gods, that you had a god for every city, a patron god, as you can describe it. And each temple that was in the city was a warehouse for grain where the priests would distribute it. So you can see, to the people, the grain and the harvest becomes tied with their god. And that's going to affect how they worship. There was slavery at this time, we know from the writings. Now, these were not slaves based on race. These were slaves based on prisoners of war. If you took a city, captured a city, the people could become slaves to you and do a lot of the labor. And slaves were property. They could be bought and sold. This early period of the Sumerians was a time of conflict between the city-states. And who led? Was it the leaders of the war, or was it the kings? What made the king the king? This is going to start to be determined during this time. So these conflicts would not only determine who was in charge, but who became the overlords, who became the slaves, and also who was, what religion was practiced at the time. A group of the tablets that we found, about 12 of them, were in fact an epic poem. And an epic poem is basically a very long poem that tells the story of a hero who must go on a journey. And this journey will inform him of the world, of himself. He must conquer monsters, he must face up to his fears, and he must eventually return home a changed individual. This epic poem we call the Epic of Gilgamesh because it tells the story of the hero Gilgamesh. He was a legendary king of Uruk. There might have been a real Gilgamesh, but certainly the character in the poem is a mythological character. He's mythological for several reasons. Number one, he is described as being the son of a god. In other words, according to the Sumerians, Gilgamesh is 1/3 human and 2/3 god. Kind of shows you that the Sumerians didn't know much about genetics, because you can't get someone 1/3 one something and 2/3 the other. But besides that, the epic poem talks about Gilgamesh as a hero, as the mightiest person in the kingdom, as the most beautiful person in the kingdom. His mother is a special goddess in the kingdom, etc., etc. But he is not a kind king. He is, in fact, a king that abuses his people. When you read certain sections of the epic poem, you'll see why. And so the people of Uruk ask the gods to give them relief from this awful king. And the gods send a wild man named Enkidu. And he is as strong as Gilgamesh, but he is from the wilderness. He's all hairy, he wears furs, he eats grass, he drinks out of the rivers and ponds, and he runs with the gazelles. So he is identified with the wild, as opposed to Gilgamesh, who is identified with the cultured city. Gilgamesh wears clothes and beautiful gems and, drinks wine or beer, etc., etc. So these two are pitted against each other. They are fairly evenly matched. And what happens is that they become best friends, and they go on all sorts of adventures with each other until they make a goddess angry, and Enkidu is killed. He dies. Gilgamesh is absolutely saddened, totally saddened by this, and he becomes fearful of death. So he goes on an epic journey to find everlasting life. And so most of this poem deals with his travels and his journeys. But what the poem reflects to us is the fear that these people had of the unknown, the fear they had of the wild, and the fear that they had of the gods. And so we see a culture that shapes itself and its religion around this very fear. During the Uruk period, the period covered by the Sumerians, the gods are identified as forces of nature. They are nature gods. They are gods of the wind, gods of the sun, gods of rocks. They are not necessarily personified. Until a little bit later, they take on a more human form. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is a goddess who wants to marry Gilgamesh because he is so beautiful. So they take on these very human forms. And the humans, the priests and the Sumerians, saw their gods as completely ruling their lives. One of their creation myths describes the gods as having this wild drinking party, and they're smashing the crockery and this and that and making a total mess. And as gods, they look around afterwards and say, well, who's going to clean this up? And one of the gods gets the bright idea to invent servants, men, to clean this up. So they see themselves completely subservient to these gods. As well as this relating the gods and the temples and the food distribution together, their worship becomes what we call reciprocal, meaning that the humans make sacrifices to the gods so that the gods will give them something. They were not taught by the gods yet to have certain morals. The gods didn't talk about how you be good. It was merely a reciprocal process. I give you something, you give me something. When we see cultures advance into more complex forms, we're going to see the relationship between people and gods change drastically. The Sumerians and the people of Mesopotamia were extremely clever. They were very self-reliant and they were very ingenious. These are the people who figure out how to make copper tools and copper weapons that they use to both fight and they also use to build things. They will eventually learn the smelting process and mixing copper with another element called tin or arsenic as well, and they will create a substance known as bronze. Which is easier to work with and harder than copper itself. In fact, it is the bronze that will give this age its name, the Bronze Age. It's the Sumerians that invent the wheel, possibly from devising the potter's wheel that they spun the pots on and figuring out that you could turn it to its side, put a wagon on it, and pull it. So they're going to invent the wheel, they're going to invent chariots, and they're going to invent carts. And they're going to figure out how to hook their domesticated animals up to these carts. And they can carry much more in the cart. Also, the chariot is going to develop into the great fighting technology of the Bronze Age. The Sumerians also had a very sophisticated mathematical system based on the phases of the moon. They develop a lunar calendar, meaning it works about every 28 days. This lunar calendar is accurate to a point, and then it starts getting a little confused because remember, the orbit of the moon, even though it orbits the Earth, doesn't match the orbit of the Earth around the sun, meaning that the orbit of the moon is about 28 and something days, and the orbit of the Earth around the sun is 364 and a little bit more than a quarter days. So mathematically, they don't add up well. So the lunar calendar is going to have to be fixed quite often, and it's not going to match the later calendars that we have. There are groups that still use the lunar calendar. The Islamic people will be using the lunar calendar even today, which is why Ramadan, which happens every 10 lunar months, moves according to the Western solar calendar. They're also going to base their mathematics not on base 10, they will base it on base 60, which is a very bizarre number to base it on. We divide hours into 60 minutes. We divide minutes into 60 seconds. That's a holdover of the Sumerian mathematics. These people also traded. We know they traded quite a bit by the artifacts they left behind. There are things that end up in their artifacts and in their stories that simply are not available between the Tigris and Euphrates River. In fact, copper is not available close by, and tin certainly isn't. We also know that they interchanged with the Egyptians and with the Persians, which is a civilization to the east of the Sumerians. So we know they went both west and east. Don't forget, there's a whole other civilization in what we now call India, which is far to the east of Mesopotamia, and there was a very advanced civilization along the Indus River. And we know that there was occasionally trade between these two. This is an artifact left behind by the Sumerians. It is a chest that held important objects. And we know it's important because it has precious and semi-precious stones decorating it. So it's obviously a very important piece of art. And in this, we see the Sumerian army. We see the fighters, we see some of the people that are around the fighters, and we see their elegant chariots. Now, their chariots are four-wheeled and very heavy, and they have to use 4 horses per chariot, mainly because they haven't figured out the harnessing yet. And if you look closely, you will see these chariots are being pulled by 4 horses with ropes around their necks. Now, when you put a rope around a horse's neck, you're starting to strangle it. So these horses aren't going to pull very hard. So they're not using the horse to its greatest amount of power. That's going to come later. Also, when you change your chariot from 4 wheels to 2 wheels, you get an advantage in speed as well. The blue on this piece of art is lapis lazuli, which is a special semi-precious stone that is only available at this time from the area we know as Afghanistan, far to the north and east of Mesopotamia. The red is a stone called carnelian, which was a very important stone. It has all sorts of representations about it, but that's not available in Mesopotamia either. And one of the third colors you see in there is gold. That is gold. That shows you how precious whatever went in this container was. So when you're looking at that, you're looking at a very sophisticated piece of art. By the way, there's two sides to this. The other side of this container is about peacetime, but I wanted to show you this because you could see the chariots. The temples that were built by the Sumerians and later groups had a particular design. And if you look at it carefully, it looks like a pyramid, or kind of a truncated pyramid, multiple levels up. And one thing you'll notice about this ziggurat, as these temples were called, are the huge, long stairways. It seems like it would be very tiring to go up these stairways. It would take a long time. You'd have to be in good shape to go up them with any speed. But let me do a little bit of a thought experiment with you. If you've ever been to the Lincoln Memorial in downtown DC, that beautiful memorial, you start at the bottom and then you have to go up a long process of stairs. These are very wide stairs. And once you get to the top, you're tired. You're breathing hard. You're in a different state than you were down at the bottom. And I think having these long stairways is quite intentional. It changes your perception as you go up. The Sumerians are eventually going to be beaten by a new group that will be called the Babylonians. And their main ruler, the most important one for our purposes, was a fellow by the name of Hammurabi, who takes the throne in 1792. Hammurabi was a very clever ruler, a good military general, but more clever than good. He gets the other groups fighting amongst themselves, and then he jumps in and beats them once they're all tired out. So he will take control over a great number of city-states, and he will rule them in a very clever way. We don't know if other rulers did this or not, but because we have the evidence, we can say Hammurabi did this. What he did was create a law code. Other kings had law codes, but what Hammurabi does with it is very, very clever. First of all, the law code interweaves religion and politics and how to behave, or ethos, for the whole society. It unites everyone because he makes sure everyone knows the law code. And he is going to frame the law code as if it comes from his god, or the god of Babylonians, Marduk. That's their big god, and he uses the power of Marduk from the city of Marduk in order to rule his kingdom. Now, what's interesting about this law code is that he has it engraved on large black stone columns called stelae. And these stelae, a few of them still exist, but he had them carved and set up in every single little city and town so that everyone could see them. All around the column were his code, his law code. His law code was particularly harsh in today's standards and not at all equally applied, meaning that the rich person had a different set of rules and a different set of punishments for them than a slave did, or a poor person, or a woman, or someone who was a foreigner. So you see, they divided the civilization into social groups and then applied the laws and punishment according to social groups. So if a rich man killed another rich man, he would have a different punishment than if that rich man killed a slave, and vice versa. And so this law code, as I said, was particularly harsh. It did not have prison sentences because it didn't have jails, as far as we know. But it was quite literally an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And this is where we can see this concept first at work. The stelae are also brilliant pieces of what we would call propaganda. In other words, setting out the agenda for the king that everyone could see. Because carved on the top of these black stelae were two images. The image of Hammurabi and the image of the god Marduk. Marduk, the god, is the one sitting on a throne. In fact, his feet do not touch the ground. They're on a dais, so he is not at all in any sort of subservient way. He is on his throne. The man standing in front of him holding the clay tablet that we assume the laws are on is, of course, Hammurabi. And in this demonstration, Hammurabi is telling the population, these laws are from my god Marduk. If you do not want to make the god angry, you need to follow them. So it's a brilliant piece of propaganda. It makes Hammurabi the conduit for the god, as well as the person who is going to carry out the punishment. So an interesting person at this time. So at this point, we go to the second great civilization that we'll be talking about in this chapter, and that is Egypt. Egypt was the old civilization. It will not change substantially for thousands of years. In fact, the other groups will call Egypt old. And it gets a chance to develop because of where it's situated and how it is situated. It is situated on the Nile River, a large, slow-moving river that runs south to north from the jungles of Uganda all the way up to the Mediterranean Sea. It took a long time before we actually traced the full length of this river. The Egyptians lived on a very narrow corridor on both sides of the river. Outside of that narrow corridor was desert. And so this shaped the Egyptians' cosmos. They saw themselves as the center of the cosmos, living in what we know as Black Egypt. And the desert, outside of it, is Red Egypt. Black Egypt was fertile, the black earth, because the Nile flooded every year. It flooded like clockwork every year, same time, same stages. It wouldn't be a huge flood and then a small flood. It would be the same time, the same flood, and it would bring all the compost from the jungles up in the south of Uganda, bring those all up and spread them on the fertile plains of Egypt, creating an even more fertile land. So that's Black Egypt. it's orderly, it's fertile. Red Egypt, because nothing would grow there, because it was full of sandstorms, etc., was not orderly. It was chaotic and strange. And so the desert, the Nile, fertilized the civilization. The desert kept them not only contained, but kept the invaders out. Egypt will have the luxury of having year after year to develop their own kingdom, because they're not fighting wars with each other. They're able to grow and prosper where they are. And they create a very powerful, centrally governed state controlled by pharaohs. Pharaoh is not the word for king, it's the word for family. Meaning that it wasn't just one guy ruling, it was a family that would take over the ruling, and this made a more stable government. In other words, if you've got one clunker of a pharaoh, he's going to be gone soon enough, and hopefully a better one will take his place. Egypt's going to be divided into 3 separate kingdoms, Old, Middle, and New. And these are going to change quite drastically. So here's Egypt and the map. The pharaoh is going to have all the power in Egypt. We know pretty much who was pharaoh for about 3,000 years, because a later Egyptian historian by the name of Manetho is going to write out this genealogy in detailed form. And from the archaeological evidence and everything we have found, he was pretty correct. He was writing before our current era, and he still got things correct. He missed one pharaoh, the very earliest, who is called in some of the works King Scorpion. So if you've watched the movie The Mummy, yeah, that guy. So the earliest pharaoh that really unified both kingdoms is a fellow by the name of Narmer. We don't know a lot about him. The administrative capital of Egypt is a city called Memphis, which is in Lower Egypt. The pharaoh did not rule by divine right. He was divine. He was seen as the earthly manifestation of the falcon-headed god Horus. Egyptian gods are easy to identify because most of them have animal heads. So if you see on Egyptian artwork a creature that has a head of an animal, that's a god. That's not just a different sort of being. So the pharaoh was the manifestation of Horus. The oldest kingdom, we have difficulty interpreting a lot of their records, but we do know that the power was centralized in the office of the pharaoh, but he had appointed governors called nomarchs, and he had an extensive bureaucracy. We're going to see throughout this history, bureaucracy means a lot. It's very important. Those empires that have an effective, efficient bureaucracy are going to do better than those empires, even those empires that have mighty armies. It's the bureaucracy that's going to keep the empire going. And we're going to find a lot of characters who are going to conquer a lot, but not know how to rule. We know how to read the hieroglyphs now. We didn't know how to read them for almost 2,000 years. It wasn't until the very early 1800s that we found a way to read them. And herein lies a very strange story of a large black stone called the Rosetta Stone. The people who sold the language program got their name from this particular stone. The Rosetta Stone has hieroglyphs written on top. It has a priestly scribal language that is faster to write than the hieroglyphs on top. And then the bottom is Greek. That's a story I'm going to tell a little bit later, why there would be Greek writing. Someone figured out in the 19th century that what if these three languages said the exact same thing? And so that's why they were able to decipher the hieroglyphs. They knew the Greek, they could then work with the scribal language, and then they could match it up with the hieroglyphs. So that's why we know that how to read them for the most part. Writing was an extraordinarily important way that the bureaucracy kept control of Egypt. Controlled its history, controlled its genealogy, sent messages all over. Now, most of the messages were not written in stone. What they created, and what the Egyptians had a monopoly on for a long time, was a substance called papyrus. It is the interior stem of a water plant that's harvested, that's scraped like you would scrape the outer skin off of a carrot, and then it's mashed and soaked, and then it's woven together. Once it dries properly, it's then sanded so that it's got a fairly smooth surface, and then you can paint on it, draw on it, write on it. It's still somewhat fragile, but it is flexible, and it is an okay surface to write on, and it's not like writing on stone, carving in stone. So it's papyrus that ran the bureaucracy in Egypt that made it go and successful. And you can still, if you go to Egypt now, you can get a demonstration on how it's made and have it painted. It's very cool. So I want to talk briefly about one of the great administrators of the Old Kingdom. His name was Imhotep. He was a very learned man. He was the highest official. He was right under the pharaoh. He was literate. He understood medicine. He understood astronomy, theology, mathematics, and architecture. And it's Imhotep who is going to give the Egyptians their signature symbol for their greatness, for their pharaohs. He will devise the step pyramid. It's going to be built a little bit west of their capital city, Memphis, and it will be the symbol of pharaonic power. It doesn't look, well, much like the fancy pyramids that will come into existence later. It's just stones piled on stones piled on stones. However, these stones have to be cut. And this is in much better shape than the ziggurats and the temples of Babylonia, if only because the Egyptians had stone to work with. They're not using mud bricks. So they're using solid stone and cutting this up. And this was the pyramid that Imhotep built for his pharaoh, Djoser. We know Imhotep. We know very little about Djoser. It is in one of the earliest dynasties, or the fourth dynasty of the Old Kingdom, when we get the true, beautiful pyramids that we know today. Now, about 2,000 years after they were built, a Greek historian by the name of Herodotus saw them. So he saw them in pretty good shape. The pyramids we see today are not in as good of shape as Herodotus saw them. Herodotus, unfortunately, does not give us any clue as to how the pyramids were built. I know a lot of people talk about aliens, but there's a lot of evidence that humans built the pyramids. And it was not a slave project. We have the buildings where the workers were housed. There are no chains, there are no bars on the windows. These are comfortable housing for large numbers of people. These housing also include huge ovens to bake bread in, and they include beer vats for brewing beer. So these guys were fed very well. We also have all the tools that they used. The obelisk, which is the long, tall column that they would make with the point on top, like the Washington Monument. We have one of those as it's being cut out. And those were cut out of stone, directly out of stone, and they found a big enough piece of stone, they cut down the sides, and then they would cut underneath until it fell over, and they were able to get it out of the pit that they had made by cutting. At some point in the cutting process, after they got it down the sides and they were working their way underneath this column, the stone split. It was useless. And the workers just downed their tools and left. They couldn't get anything out of it. Nobody wanted a short, half obelisk. They wanted a full obelisk. So we have their tools. We have their copper and bronze tools. So we saw how they worked the stone. We also have graffiti that was left behind by some of the workers. And this graffiti, in essence, says, this such and such team laid 100 stones today, as a challenge. This is a challenge to other groups to lay more stones than they did. Obviously, they took pride in what they were doing. They were craftsmen. They were people who were building something greater than themselves that would last. It still lasts. It's the only one of the great old 7 wonders of the ancient world that's still up, and it's still available for us to see. The pyramids at Giza are amazing, very tall. If you look at this picture, you can see the little black dots at the bottom that are people. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that these pyramids were covered with white limestone. It was a very thin veneer of limestone, but obviously very helpful in terms of building other things. So a lot of it was stolen. A lot of the stones from these pyramids have been stolen to build other things. But according to Herodotus, the very tip, the last few feet of these pyramids were gold. And so they could be seen for miles. The tallest thing that anyone had built, and it was bright white with a gold top. It must have been a spectacular sight. Now, Egypt was not all completely peaceful. There were tensions between the priests and the different towns. Remember, these are still people who had their own home god, and the priests would be serving that god and run into conflicts with the next town over who had a different god. So there were still some tensions locally, etc. So Egypt is going to have a little bit of bump, but nothing like the Babylonians suffered. The Egyptians are not going to be good at technology and science, save for one. They are going to be way behind the Sumerians and the people in Mesopotamia in science and especially in math. They will develop the solar calendar, meaning that they will look to the seasons of the year and where the sun is positioned as their guide. Because they developed the solar calendar, because they needed to know that when the Nile would flood so they could get everybody out of the way, this developed into a very different aspect, a very different way of looking at their gods and their geology. They had an extremely effective irrigation system and water control systems, as you imagine they would have to develop. The Nile was also a highway for them, boats up and down constantly, but they did not develop the wheel. They got the wheel eventually from the Sumerians, but they would not develop the wheel. The one science in which the Egyptians were good at, that no one else was good at, was medicine. Interestingly enough, because of the burial practices of the Egyptian culture, the mummification practices, they knew a lot about the body, physiology. They knew a lot about the organs, maybe not exactly what the organs did, but they knew what they were. Because in the process of mummification, you very gently take out the organs and you mummify them separately and you put them in Coptic jars and kept them separate. So they knew a lot about the inside of people, and they did not have a taboo about touching dead bodies, which many other civilizations had, especially later. So the Egyptians understood the body better than any of the ancient people. There was one aspect, however, that they did not understand, and this is going to get gross. They did not know what the brain was for. They assumed it was a place where the blood went and cooled off. Brain tissue is mainly fat. And so they didn't understand that the brain was where the thought was. They thought it was in the heart. And so they would take the brain out and throw it away. Fat would turn rancid more quickly than any other part of the body. The brain would start to rot. So they got that out immediately with hooks through the nose. It's really gross. So they did not exactly know what everything was for, and they were totally wrong about the brain. But they had all sorts of wonderful technologies in terms of boats. They had terrific boats, and they left instructions like this one on how to build them, how they were constructed. So they're passing their knowledge down to future generations. I mean, you could look at these stone carvings, and yeah, you could understand how a boat's built. I mean, it's better than IKEA directions. Egyptian society and culture we know a few things about. We know that there was a very high elite, the royalty, the nobility, members of the priestly group, and then there was everybody else. To think of them being middle class or lower class, those are very modern distinctions. There would simply be the elite and everybody else. Some of them were poor, some of them were somewhat well off. So Egypt didn't have it quite as badly as some other places. Women in the Old Kingdom had a high degree of legal status, meaning that they are referred to in the various accounts. There are laws that we see that allow them a certain sort of status above that of slave or property. They were not allowed to hold office in the Old Kingdom. So we do not see female priests. We do not see females in the leadership. This is going to change later on. The Egyptian religion. We have a very skewed understanding of their religion because all we find are their mausoleums where they buried people. It's as if you were trying to tell the story of our faith traditions throughout the United States by only looking at our graveyards. You wouldn't get a really positive attitude about their religion. In fact, from what we can understand from the writings, the Egyptians had a very positive attitude towards death. It was not a death cult, if you would. They had very strong traditions of life recreation and renewal. Some historians think that's partially because of the cycle of the Nile, this beneficent river that flooded every year and renewed the land. In a way, that kind of makes sense. Their mythology also is very much focused on life, renewal, and recreation. And let me give you an example. And that example is the myth of Osiris and Isis. It is a myth of life from death. Essentially, Isis and Osiris were husband and wife and brother and sister. There was not necessarily a taboo for royal children to marry each other. The Osiris was the male god who ruled over the earth as the initial, the original pharaoh. He's the guy in the middle. His wife Isis is next to him. She is acquainted with fertility. And Isis and Osiris are two of the very few deities in the Egyptian pantheon that have human faces. Osiris ruled over Black Egypt, fertile Egypt, Egypt that is orderly and plentiful. He had a brother, though. His brother's name was Set. Set got a bum deal. He got to rule over Red Egypt, the land of chaos and sandstorms and desert. And he was extremely jealous of Osiris and his beautiful land. And so at one point, according to this myth, he captures Osiris, chops him up into little bitty pieces, and spreads the pieces of the body all over Egypt. Isis, his wife, is absolutely beside herself with grief. She cries and cries and cries. Sometimes the flooding of the Nile River is associated with Isis's tears. Isis finds all the parts of Osiris. She searches throughout Egypt, finds all of his parts, and puts them together and wraps them in white cloth. You can see where this is going with the idea of the mummies all wrapped in white cloth. Osiris is not able to rule Earth properly because he has been taken apart and put back together. However, he will, at this point, sire a child with Isis, and that child is Horus, the falcon-headed god. So their son Horus steps in as the new leader here on Earth in Egypt, which is why the pharaohs are seen as the manifestation of Horus, while Osiris takes his place in the afterlife, the underworld. The Egyptian understanding of the afterlife was very positive. Osiris ruled there and determined whether you were fit to stay in the afterlife or not fit to stay in the afterlife. So you can see by this image, there's Osiris. He's all wrapped in white. He's got a sickly tinge to his face. But you will also see that he's holding two items. The one thing is a flail, a wheat flail. It was used in agriculture to separate the wheat from the chaff. It would beat the wheat kernels and separate the wheat from the chaff. The other instrument is a shepherd's crook. And these symbols were the symbols of the pharaoh. They're oftentimes, almost always, pictured with these items. The shepherd's crook symbolizes the pharaoh is a shepherd to his people. He keeps them safe. The wheat chaff, a wheat flail, is symbolic of the pharaoh separating the good wheat from the chaff, the stuff that's not usable, in terms of justice. Those who are good are kept, those who are bad are sent away. We have a papyrus written by a scribe by the name of Ani. And he puts down on his papyrus, tells the entire story of what it would be like, religious tradition, of dying and going to the afterlife. And this papyrus tells us what we need to know about the process. Now, as I said before, the Egyptians thought all of their thinking and thoughts and feeling resided in their heart. And if you were a good person, you would have no sins weighing down your heart. Your heart would be light. If you were a bad person, your sins would be in your heart and it would be heavy. Meaning that to decide who was good and who was bad after death was a simple empirical measurement. They used a scale. So this Ani in his papyrus demonstrates the use of the scale, and his heart is on the left and it's measured against a feather. And you can see the jackal-headed god is doing the measurement while the ibis-headed god is standing behind him taking notes. The ibis-headed god is Tot. So if your heart is light and it does well against the measurement besides a feather, you are allowed to go to the afterworld and be with Osiris. If your heart is heavy, then, well, your heart would be then fed to the creature in the far right. That creature's name is Amut. And Amut had the head of the crocodile, the mane of a lion, the forebody of a cheetah, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. These are the most dangerous creatures in all of Egypt. And they're all personified, or at least gathered together, aggregated in this one horrible creature. And this horrible creature's job was to eat the hearts of sinful people. Once your heart is eaten, you would not be allowed into the afterlife. So it really was a religious idea of being good, not necessarily the reciprocal, I do something good for you, you do something good for me, but this sense of you should be a good person. And that's kind of it for the Egyptians in the Old Kingdom.